Which one of you slimy gits do I have to crump? If I've told you once, I've told you a gazillion times. I'm the biggest, meanest, and most overtly masculine archetype in this mob. And that means I'm the boss.
Okay. Hopefully your speakers are still intact. If you'll permit me to brag for just a moment, that monologue was an absolutely perfect example of the kind of orcs that we are used to seeing in the Warhammer gaming franchise. Warhammer orcs are big, violent, mean, and ugly. They are the epitome of the grim darkness for which Warhammer is famous. Only they don't seem to be having a bad time. In order to properly explain what being an orc means to me, I have to explain where they come from, what they are, and what they mean to us in the modern fantasy genre. As boring as it may seem, we can largely thank Lord of the Rings for the common characterization of orcs that we see today. Like basically everything else in the sword and sorcery genre, most depictions of orcs are interpretations or reinterpretations of Tolkien's infamous trilogy. His influence on these creatures can hardly be overstated. Countless generations of fantasy writers have had their ideas about so-called monstrous races informed by his choice to depict the orcs as a kind of symbolic opposite of the elves. Tolkien's elves were beautiful, eternal, graceful, and white, whereas orcs were ugly, destructive, barbaric, and not white. Yeah, sorry, Tolkien stans. There's no nice way to put that. The simple notion that a group of inhuman monsters, or otherwise alien beings, could be accurately described as a race is incredibly problematic. Even the idea that different kinds of humans can be grouped into races is an imaginary concept popularized by bigoted quacks in the days before real science. Having said that, I don't feel personally equipped to unpack this discussion. At least I don't feel as though I can add anything which hasn't already been said more clearly by more qualified voices. I'll try to link some of their content in the description. Instead, I came here today to have a discussion about gender.
What the zoggin' heck is a gender?
I heard of this kind of thing before. It means to write everything down in a little book. To keep them organised.
Even if their origins are somewhat questionable, it's clear that there was something very charming and familiar about Tolkien's orcs. They're supposed to be little more than savage monsters, and yet they seem as close to humanity as any monster could possibly be. Apart from having relatively human physiology, we see several times throughout Tolkien's works that the orcs have the capacity to cooperate, to communicate, to experience suffering and pain. In short, we see that they are mortal. From this perspective, it becomes clear that the cruelty and violence for which the orcs are known, in other words, their greatest faults, are actually their most human characteristics. They are a reflection of ourselves, looking back at us through a broken mirror. And in that reflection, we see that what is most monstrous about these creatures are not the parts of them which are different, but those parts which are exactly the same.
Just a mouthful. A bit off the flank.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
In the decades following the release of the Lord of the Rings novels, the sword and sorcery genre became increasingly popular. Both Warhammer and Dungeons & Dragons share a common ancestor in the history of that genre, specifically a game called Chainmail. Chainmail was the precursor to the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, but its rules and gameplay much more closely resemble Warhammer and other modern wargames like it. The characterization of orcs in these two games represents different facets of the same pulp fantasy prism, a prism developed in the wake of Tolkien's hit novels. In this new world of syndicated pulp fantasy, it became pervasive to recreate Tolkien's most popular tropes, sometimes with exaggerated details. And, as the original standard bad guy in Tolkien's novels, the orcs were usually one of the first creatures to be retrofitted toward whatever new aesthetic these fantasy writers were trying at the time. In almost every fantasy production imaginable, there's going to be a faction of evil green dudes who exist just to fill the role of generic antagonist whenever it's convenient. In some cases, they may be called trolls or goblins, or maybe even ogres, but regardless, they're almost always green, they're almost always portrayed as savage, and they are usually expected to do very little other than raid and pillage.
I don't get it, Shrek. Why don't you just pull some of that ogre stuff on him? You know, throttle him, lay siege to his fortress, grind his bones to make your bread. You know, the whole ogre trip.
Oh, I know what. Maybe I could have decapitated an entire village and put their heads on a pike, got a knife, cut open their spleen and drink their fluids. Does that sound good to you?
No, not really, no.
But no matter how fearsome, bad guys are always destined to lose to the good guys. And so, after nearly a century of recycling Tolkien's ideas, most incarnations of the orc have developed a winning personality to go along with their losing persona. Though they're always doomed to lose, orcs generally carry on with a surprising amount of optimism. In these tales of good and evil, which deal with themes that are taller than life itself, the simple aspirations of the orcs often come across as even more human than human.
What's this kid saying? I oughta crump ya for calling me a you-me.
For generations, the entire fantasy genre was content to simply recycle orcs as these generic green bad guys. But then, one day, the writers at Games Workshop decided to be different. In the 1980s, they experimented with a new game which they called Warhammer 40,000, a sci-fi war game with rules inspired by their successful fantasy franchise of the same name. The orcs could no longer be content with green skin and pointy teeth to distinguish them from the human army on the other side of the battlefield. They needed to be alien and exotic. They needed to be space orcs. I don't think I can properly describe the scale of the lore in Warhammer 40,000, let alone tell you all there is to know about the space orcs, but Games Workshop chose to imagine them as an invasive, monogendered species of sentient extraterrestrial fungus. Yes, you heard me correctly. These things are genderless space mushrooms. At first, the two games were only loosely correlated, but as 40K became more popular and successful, Games Workshop started to draw more direct connections between the factions in 40K and their counterparts in the fantasy version, which is how the orcs became what they are across all versions of Warhammer. Violent, genderless mushrooms, which reproduce via spores.
This kid's just making up words now. What are spores?
I think it's like a little sandwich made of marshmallow and graham crackers.
Perhaps you can tell that in spite of my flawless voiceovers, I am not a mindless, violent savage. I'm actually pretty sensitive and quiet most of the time. This makes me noticeably different in a way which instantly shatters most people's perceptions about my masculinity. The word queer was used to describe me so often that one day I decided to just embrace it. But before I did embrace my identity as a queer person, I felt a lot of pressure to act in a hyper-masculine way. And I'm a great actor, so I played the role pretty well. But I was always playing a role. Living in a world filled with toxic masculinity comes with its own set of challenges as a queer person. In order to stay safe in toxic environments, I've learned to roll with the punches and play the roles that men have projected onto me. For that reason, I have always felt a kinship with the orcs. Though they have no gender, they refer to one another as boys. Something about that has always resonated with me as a mask-presenting non-binary person. Like everything in Warhammer, the hyper-masculinity of these genderless mushrooms has been dialed up way past 11. They neither need nor desire to make any sense at all. They enthusiastically embrace their hypermasculine social roles in a way which is as honest as it is completely exaggerated. There is something so freeing about such a simplified existence. They are free to literally be themselves in a way that I am not. And yet, narratively, they represent a duality which has always been present in my life. Being born in the image of a hideous monster and having no choice but to embrace it.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
This is often talked about as a part of the queer experience, the need to look for and find representation within existing media. Thanks to legislation like the Hays Code, explicit and positive depictions of queer folk have been rare in pop culture. Queer audiences have often been forced to read between the lines in order to find characters which represent them. As a non-binary person, I am extremely grateful to have basically grown up with the orcs. I wouldn't call them role models, nor would I say that any faction in the Warhammer universe is a positive depiction of anything. And yet it's really important to me that they are not a sexually dimorphic species. They directly and explicitly challenge the Puritan definitions of gender with their mere existence. And yet they are such hypermasculine caricatures that they put the Astartes to shame. I don't have to imagine that they represent me, because they are just like me. At least, that's how I've always seen them.